Well, dear listeners, what happens to the hand after it gives an order whose effects travel farther than the arm can reach? I picture a small office at day's end, where grey files line the shelves while a wooden tagged key rests beside a pen upon the desk. Between those modest objects lives the ancient bargain of office, for one grants entry, while the other releases a decision into human life. Resting upon varnished wood, the key appears harmless, its metal carrying only the light that falls across it. Once carried in a pocket, however, it alters the bearer's walk, for every locked room places a claim upon the person trusted with access. Habit gradually enters the muscles through the repeated testing of latches, the settling of accounts, and the placing of a signature where hesitation once delayed action. Public duty, in my experience, begins after colleagues have gone home and the building has surrendered its daytime voices. Beneath fluorescent light, one figure remains with a petition written by a frightened hand, while abandoned cups leave brown rings beside papers awaiting judgment. Across town, a family waits for the answer contained in those pages, as a laborer elsewhere depends upon a repaired road before winter breaks the axle of his cart. Paper reaches the official's eye, though consequence enters another person's day. Yet civic service carries dignity through the patient labor by which communities retain order when memory, favor, or fatigue weaken judgment. Forms and schedules gain moral weight through use, for calculation precedes the bridge, while figures entered by candlelight allow grain to reach a depot. In that setting, the desk becomes a workbench, where quiet administrative effort acquires visible form in roads, supplies, wages, and shelter. For the artist, such labor opens a difficult chamber in which imagination meets the demand for settlement. Imagination can preserve several truths inside one image, whereas administration must select a course whose effects pass into shared existence. Administrative language therefore changes under duty, as dates harden into deadlines, while figures acquire the force to alter another household. Goethe entered Weimar, carrying the fame of a young writer whose words had crossed Europe like flame. Court service placed access within his hand, opening rooms where admiration gave way to responsibility and public usefulness acquired practical form. Responsibility then drew near with the severe satisfaction of action carried into civic life, asking the poet to test imagination against scarcity, rank, labor, and consequence. Tonight I approach that crossing through the quiet sound of metal, striking a coin inside a pocket. Behind one door wait records, while another admits petitioners whose lives will receive the outcome of deliberation. Somewhere inside the official, a private chamber remains lit by memory, vocation, fear, and desire. The deepest burden begins when both doors require the same hand. Lecture 4. Seal Ledger and the Burden of Office. Early Weimar Administration, an Inner Crisis. I ask how a stamped crest can hold human power in its small hardened face. A wax disc cools on folded parchment, while the engraved metal lifts away, leaving a settled choice exposed in daylight, with the sternness of a verdict. Such an object keeps a modest physical scale, while carrying a dense cargo of consequence. Hardened resin contains delegated authority. Beneath its gloss lives the knowledge of one hand, acting securely beneath another man's title. Hesitation has been pressed into final form. During Goethe's early Weimar years, the ducal signet becomes the precise vessel of his personal history, drawing a large civic drama down into a shape that fits between thumb with forefinger. He came to court in 1775, bearing the bright flame of literary rebellion, already marked by the astonishing triumph of his novel about young Werther, then took his place beside Duke Karl August, translating poetic event into administrative labor. The alteration came with exact order. The poet arrived at ducal request, gained swift favor, entered the Privy Council, acquired practical duties reaching from road construction to subterranean ore extraction, while military logistics also passed under his supervision. Thus the wax object records a total passage. The hour arrives when the architect of emotion enters the hard architecture of civic rule. I understand this crossing as a deliberate embrace of worldly duty, far removed from any sentimental fable about an artist corrupted by office. Goethe approached civic labor as a hungry man approaches bread, set firmly on a table. Something deep in his earlier Frankfurt formation had already prepared his spirit for public usefulness, placing the real danger of Weimar inside that very readiness. His home city had given him a prosperous civic household, legal training, plus a firm conviction that public life carries immense dignity. From those fiery youthful years came other gifts: daring fervor in the blood, impatience with inherited manners, a driving certainty that interior weather could become world-shaping speech. Readers consulting the record of the 1770s find a clear map of explosive productivity as theatrical works joined lyrical bursts to produce a flood of energy that made contemporaries see him as the incarnation of feral genius. Yet that brilliant mind kept a strict inner compass. Even in his earliest writings, I find a soul intensely preoccupied by vocation, seeking the correct path while wrestling the severe peril of excess. Service in the duchy, therefore, appeared attractive through firm reality, bringing his spirit very close to authentic action. Such service carried danger by threatening to harden the same form into an enclosure. Holding the cooled wax clarifies the central contradiction. A manuscript remains open while the quill moves across the page. Any letter may pause, turn, revise its course, or break off. The seal belongs to the final stage of a process. Once pressed firmly against paper, it declares that the season of personal oscillation has expired. Government survives by enforcing that kind of finality. Officials build the road or postpone it before winter makes the ruts into law. Mines reopen under order, or darkness keeps the galleries sealed while ore sleeps beneath timber and water. Treasurers balance an account, accept a deficit, or make scarcity speak through figures that leave someone poorer by morning. Across a given geography, military burden becomes a measurable strain carried by bodies, horses, carts, depots, and weather. Court service moved the poet from expressive intensity into an order of determined consequence. His earlier days had offered little preparation for the daily task of finishing dilemmas that admitted only practical resolutions. Giving Europe a magnificently suffering hero requires one kind of genius. Calculating transport logistics while inspecting resources requires a different stamina. Compelling a man to guarantee administrative outcomes inside a duchy that demanded concrete sustenance over pure sensibility. The wax disc understands that severe distinction. It registers the wide gap between a trembling poetic line and a command demanding obedience. I linger with Duke Karl August. Excessive commentary romanticizes their relationship as youthful friendship, while another flattened commentary reduces the bond to patronage. Both readings miss the density of their shared history. The Duke possessed a young, energetic, restless spirit, gathering brilliant minds around his throne, while granting his new companion the immediate public reach that Frankfurt had denied him. At first the newcomer undertook lighter duties, while accompanying his patron to animate court life, though their connection quickly deepened into substantial trust, woven with practical dependence. Soon that young writer evolved into an advisor, shifted into a commissioner role, then emerged as a figure indispensable to the daily working of the duchy. Such a progression carries immense weight. The court went far beyond celebrating genius. Its halls employed his mind. Goethe accepted incorporation into the machinery of rule, moving far past the pleasure of admiration. In this sense, the signet belongs as much to the ruler as to any parchment receiving its mark, for the Duke himself stood as the living source of delegated authority. Drawing close to him meant drawing close to the power by which a private life becomes a public instrument. Such proximity changed the physical scale of Goethe's existence. A poet living in Frankfurt or Wetzlar could imagine history as something waiting for depiction, lamentation, or myth-making. Through the gates of Weimar, history acquired the sharp scent of wet paper, and wax mingled with the tense patience of petitioners, waiting inside timbered council rooms. Smallness sharpened every rivalry at court, while responsibility remained large enough to carry authentic weight. Karl August's confidence brought prestige, while society itself often displayed provincial habits layered with backbiting snobbery. That social air taught Goethe how public life contains base elements beside noble purpose. Institutions are built from human vanity, layered over deep boredom, feeding an ambition that demands constant negotiation. Into this dense human mixture descends the stamped crest, refusing pure principle. His greatness during these years lies partly in his ability to see the mixture clearly, even while receiving his own scars from the encounter. His earlier poetry reveals intense susceptibility to ordered existence. The famous rebel always harbored a deep fascination with structured limits. I see that truth most clearly in his recurring imagery of the marked path leading to an assigned course. The poem gives the image in full, like the vulture poised upon the heavy clouds of morning, resting on gentle wing while it watches for prey. So let my song hover, for a god has marked out each human path, traced it before the step. The fortunate man runs swiftly to his joyful end. But he whose heart misfortune has drawn tight struggles in vain against the bounds of that iron thread which the bitter shears cut only once. The attraction of civic life already lies latent within those lines. A distinct path has been marked for the traveler. Human beings meet shape, limit, appointment, avoiding the illusion of endless drift. Such intuition could draw a young writer into office with almost religious intensity. Service answers the desire to enter a marked trail, replacing the urge merely to invent moods upon a private stage. Yet the same verses reveal the danger with equal clarity. The trail can become an iron thread. Under pressure, a marked course may harden into total constriction. Relocation to the duchy brought that metaphysical tension into institutional reality. What had been imagined in lyric verse became enacted in bureaucracy. Consulting the chronology of that first decade lets a reader trace the contradiction through civic detail. In 1776 the poet joined the Privy Council. By 1779 the War Commission, subterranean excavations, and highways had drawn him into the working sinews of the duchy. After the departure of the Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1782, much of that burden settled on his shoulders for roughly 2.5 years, making him the principal representative of the state in highly demanding affairs. These titles amount to immersion in government, far beyond honorary decorations pinned to a literary celebrity. Highways carry the physical movement of commerce beside state power. Mines represent the subterranean economy of a territory, drawing wealth from dark earth while balancing the risks of human labor. Military work involves physical bodies, demanding logistics that make order visible through ugly mathematics. Finance demands harsh compromise, enforcing priorities through material scarcity. The wax seal on such papers abandons ornament. Necessity takes on a visible face. The new official met that necessity day after day. Prolonged exposure must have exerted a strange intoxication. A writer who has shaped imagined lives suddenly touches the heavy architecture, directing actual human bodies. Administration carries dullness in the marrow. For a mind hungry to act, it also carries the dark sweetness of consequence. The court offered him the dignity of effect. A single memorandum could alter daily practice. Through one signed decision, state funds might shift while new civic policy entered the habits of the duchy. Some call this a seduction by relevance. The written page creates worlds of its own kind. Government leaves marks on shared earth often at once. Burdened already by fame, the young celebrity likely found a fresh field for vocation inside this immediate physical consequence. He could function as more than chronicler of souls. The man could become an active participant shaping civic reality. In the wax signet, that satisfaction took on a grave shine. It told him words could press directly into substance, escaping the fate of ending in aesthetic afterglow. Such heavy promise helps explain how he desired service. He craved the strict measure it seemed to grant. Yet the civic world carries slow violence against lyric immediacy. The central crisis reached deeper than fatigue or lost hours, though both exacted a toll. Its true core was linguistic. Bureaucracy teaches a prose of closure. It prefers whatever can be quantified for transfer and record. Poetry keeps alive whatever exceeds closure, nurturing grief while protecting contradictions that resist easy reduction. His official years therefore produced a collision of languages, far more than a simple decline in creativity. One vocabulary sealed the world shut. Another mode of speech demanded openness. Procedural calm ruled the bureaucratic dialect. Living tension governed the poetic voice. Such a distinction helps a reader approach the writings of the crisis years as the field where conflict between those two linguistic orders becomes visible, far beyond any sparse residue left over after office work. The historical figure experienced this conflict as lived tension. In December 1777, troubled by friction between administrative duties and deeper vocation, he undertook a secret winter ascent of the Brocken in the Harz Mountains, taking the success of that harsh climb as a solid sign confirming his path. The anecdote stands as spiritual evidence, far more than picturesque ornament. He felt contradiction sharply enough to seek confirmation through physical ordeal layered with earthen omen. 2 years later, he again turned away from the route to Italy, hoping his duty in Germany would prove the coherence of his existence. That phrase carries weight, showing a man hoping events might prove coherence. A soul already living in harmony possesses certainty, requiring little proof. The wax mark may have verified his official station. His spirit kept asking whether that mark corresponded to higher truth. Here the drama Iphigenia in Tauris enters with terrible aptness. The play thinks through a problem the author was living, working as more than autobiography, dressed in Greek costume. Iphigenia holds a visible office that gives her a protected place inside a sacred order. Yet she remains foreign in the heart, held in a station that shelters her, while estranging her in the same breath. The opening speech bears the necessary weight of this condition. Out into your shadows, stirring boughs of the old, holy, densely leafed grove, I step again, as into the goddess' quiet sanctuary, with a shuddering feeling, as though entering it for the first time, as my spirit remains strange to this place. For many years a higher will, to which I yield myself, has kept me hidden here, yet I remain, as on the first day, a stranger. For the sea parts me from those I love, as on the shore I stand through long days, seeking the land of Greece with my soul. Everything decisive for the Weimar crisis seems present in embryo within those lines. The phrase "a higher will" preserves the speaker while keeping her stationed. It carries the burden of formal office. A higher will has directed the assignment while maintaining the role. Yet the spirit fails to acclimatize. The position fails to become home. Between station and desire, the sea stands as a wide interval, precisely where a court official might place rank as a barrier against his authentic homeland of vocation. A signet can authorize a place. It lacks power to manufacture belonging. Iphigenia's exile forms the structure of dignified estrangement, something deeper than geographical displacement. The poet serving the duchy knew that heavy condition in his own flesh. Further weight emerges from the same play. Iphigenia serves within a sacred order, yet the drama's deepest movement concerns truthful action, demanding renunciation of expediency, while keeping fidelity to something higher than function. That theme holds enormous weight for the Weimar question. Bureaucratic service encourages a mind to focus on managerial success and finalized outcomes. Iphigenia in Tauris asks whether service remains human only by answering to a moral law that precedes practical utility. His own life in office seems haunted by the same demand. He felt a driving need to be more than effective. Art kept driving his spirit to questions of purity, locating deep necessity for human truth. Here the waxmark takes on a second meaning. It begins to carry the weight, testing the conscience of the one bearing authority, leaving behind its simple role as a sign of delegated power. A servant of the court carries out commands. A writer worthy of the name must ask what those commands do to the inner order, keeping speech honest. Another poem concerning boundaries sharpens the point. Court life always invites inflation of the ego. Proximity to a prince can persuade a man that he stands closer to the divine center of action than he truly does. The verses of Limits of Humanity resist this temptation with stern majesty. The lines deserve to stand in their order. When the ancient Holy Father, with composed hand, from rolling clouds sows blessing lightnings over the earth, I kiss the outermost hem of his garment, childlike tremors deep in the breast. For each human being must keep measure beneath the gods. If he lifts himself upward and touches the stars with his brow, his uncertain souls lose hold, while clouds and winds make sport with him. Those lines read like a warning issued to the official from within the artist himself. The bureaucrat draws near to power, while the poem reminds his soul of proportion. The statesman delights in lightning and command, while the verse urges him back to the hem of the garment. Any human being who mistakes delegated authority for godlike participation loses his footing. Seen one way, the wax mark humbles the servant by reminding him that his power remains derivative. Seen another, the seal tempts a man by giving derivative power visible splendor. His early years at court unfolded between those distinct meanings. The man's later greatness would owe much to the fact that he resisted surrender to either vanity or renunciation. He learned a chastened authority there, though the schooling cost his spirit dearly. The cost becomes starker in Egmont. Here the seal darkens into the juridical face of power. One can speak of historical consciousness in the play. Yet another dimension bears directly on the Weimar years, by showing how the state destroys through bureaucratic form as readily as through spectacle. A sealed order provides the cold instrument by which political necessity clothes itself in legitimacy. The acting official knew enough of administration to understand how the violence of authority often arrives properly formatted. The tragedy of Egmont carries that knowledge in its marrow. The doomed man is processed to death through mechanisms that make public order appear lawful. In this play, the wax disc becomes the terrifying serenity of the state when it has decided against a life, abandoning any pretense of useful governance. Here Egmont in the thick of that knowledge. Ruin has arrived. Sweet life, fair and kindly habit of being and acting. From you I must part, parting so calmly. You bid me a slow farewell, far from battle's tumult, distant from the clamor of arms, removed from the scattering confusion of the melee. You take a deliberate leave. You stretch the parting moment. I must take your hand. Look once more into your eyes. Feel your beauty and worth in full vividness, then wrench myself away with resolve and say, go on. The phrase beautiful, friendly habit of being and acting deserves the longest pause. Life receives the name of the beautiful, friendly habit of being and acting. Habit here acts as the embodied pattern by which existence grows familiar to itself, far beyond trivial routine. Office shares that structure. Public function settles into the body as a repeated mode of being among others. Before a formal signature, one weighs options, hears petitions, feels the cost of decision settle into wrist and paper. The stamped crest confirms this rhythm. It teaches the self to live inside an enacted role. The play shows how terrible the sundering becomes once that rhythm is violently stripped away. His official years must have sharpened his grasp of this truth. Forms of action become intimate to the self through long habitation, doing much more than merely holding office. Such realities shows why bureaucracy can become spiritually dangerous. Machinery enters the muscles beside the syntax of thought. A historian might point out that the drafting of Egmont began before the Weimar years fully ripened. That fact is accurate, proving the underlying point even more powerfully. The author carried older problems into a new civic furnace, where they acquired colder edges beside harder knowledge, moving past what he had already settled. The early rebel could conceive political resistance in broad colors. As a seasoned official, Goethe learned how deeply procedure belongs to the machinery of domination. A military command or treasury ceases to be abstraction when one has served near its working parts. Such offices become the worldly anatomy through which power breathes. The drama therefore registers administrative intelligence beside historical sympathy. Its narrative understands that state power lies in its capacity to make finality look orderly. A mark on a document can kill more efficiently than a shouted order. The statesman poet could learn this truth only through contact. Torquato Tasso exposes the contradiction of creative dependence with supreme nakedness, surpassing every other drama from the Weimar orbit. Goethe's play, written between 1786 and 1790, follows the Renaissance court poet Tasso as he struggles under noble patronage while facing the painful contradiction of being an artist dependent on rulers he may intellectually exceed. That brief description alone makes the connection plain. The writer at court receives honor on the condition of fitting into the order granting that honor. He is cherished by virtue of adorning power. Danger enters the room the moment poetic speech ceases to remain decorative, reaching for a truth beyond the tolerance of the court. The protagonist lives inside that contradiction with fevered lucidity. Reading the text forces a reader to feel how much the creator had learned from his own years in the duchy, about the perilous economics of cultural prestige. The most decisive lines arrive where pain and speech meet. Nature has granted us the tear, the cry of pain, when at last a man can bear the load no further. Yet to me, beyond all that, she granted in suffering melody and speech, so that I might lament the deepest fullness of my distress. When the human creature falls silent in torment, a god gave me the gift to say how I suffer. The wax disc finds its most precise answer here. Administration seeks impersonal clarity. It wants quantified responsibilities leading to finalized records. Poetry begins where experience exceeds such reduction. Tears belong to all living creatures. The artist's burden remains different, demanding that he speak pain when ordinary human beings fall silent. That reality explains why the Weimar crisis must be described as an ontological collision, far beyond a scheduling problem concerning meetings or desk time. Goethe served a system whose speech tended to impersonal closure, while bearing a vocation that required personal lament to keep contradiction alive in form. Tasso is the drama of that fiercely divided calling. The court poet receives honor and suffocation in the same breath. The signed warrant authorizes his existence, while limiting where his speech may travel. Here a reader sees why the Weimar years remain essential to his development. A simplified figure composed only of lyric fervor lacks the capacity to become the author of Tasso. A flattened administrator composed only of utility and restraint also fails to become that author. From collision, the masterpiece rises. Court life taught him how speech behaves, when every word bears social consequence. The environment demonstrated how patronage dignifies a man while humiliating him in the same motion. Within the palace, refinement itself could become a prison when spectators interpreted and ranked every gesture for propriety. Such severe lessons can deepen art into tragedy, far past the simple destruction of talent. Yet those lessons also exact a terrible price from the living person. A reader feels that price, radiating through his recurrent anxiety and his drift into intense compression before the necessity of rupture. Charlotte von Stein belongs to this economy of refinement and strain. Accounts of the first Weimar period rightly give weight to her hold over the poet during a decade of intense emotional attachment. She offered a schooling in self-command, providing a finer social temporal rhythm than the raw energies of youth had known. I move past loose talk of civilizing influence. What she helped teach was the precise inner musculature by which passion might be born under strict form. That education carried immense weight for later works. It also heightened the cost of every compromise. A coarser soul can survive contradiction through sheer insensibility. A refined spirit feels the exact contour of each concession. The signet sinks much more deeply into wax when the material remains warm and responsive. Courtly discipline made him a greater artist. The same discipline made him acutely vulnerable to the deadening elements of court life. Ennoblement in 1782 makes the symbolism almost exact. His assumption of duties central to the duchy rendered the elevation effectively necessary. The state altered his name so the public person might correspond to public office. Von Goethe therefore becomes an inscription of ownership, far more than an honorific flourish. The mark moves from paper onto identity itself. Bourgeois genius receives noble branding. Social assent acknowledges extreme usefulness, yet every addition to a name fails to solve the vast riddle of vocation. The prince may raise the servant to higher rank. The ruler lacks power to create the poet. That distinction carries immense weight. Modernity begins where society discovers its ability to incorporate genius into institutions, while remaining powerless to command the deep source from which genius speaks. His Weimar life stands as one of the earliest and greatest demonstrations of that paradox. He became publicly legible as a servant of power, while remaining answerable within himself, to something power could honor yet fail to own. The duchy also taught him the cost of representability. A famous artist near a prince lives a public existence. He becomes a visible sign of the court's aspiration to high culture. His physical presence strengthened Karl August's image, just as the duke's patronage strengthened the writer's worldly position. Such reciprocity carries limited innocence. Once talent becomes representational capital, silence itself acquires political meaning. Delay looks like dereliction. Withdrawal resembles ingratitude. Even private crisis begins to read as public problem. We must imagine the suffocation of such visibility in a small court where everyone knows one's place and aggressively misreads deviation. The signet in this sense becomes a social brand, more than a simple instrument of administration. It marks the man as belonging to the courtly organism. Escape would eventually feel necessary. Italy stands as the geographical answer his spirit finally had to seek. On the 3rd of September 1786, he slipped away from Carlsbad and crossed the Brenner south into the Italian peninsula. The wording holds weight. He moved under cover of secrecy. That phrase contains exhaustion and self-rescue in one motion. A man at home in office stays comfortably at his desk. An individual squeezed by duty may flee when he still possesses to trust, the silent claim of vocation. The Italian journey was a radical revolt against administrative overdetermination. Far past the romantic simplification of liberation into sunlight and marble. Through that desperate act, he reclaimed the zone of being from the seal that had marked him too thoroughly. On his return he sought release from many former duties. The gesture acknowledges severe limits, making any announcement of contempt for service irrelevant. Bureaucratic life had given him weight and a deep knowledge of the real world. It was bound to threaten the source of his greatest work by remaining the dominant form of existence. I ask whether the creative life can endure inside bureaucracy and service. His early Weimar years answer affirmatively, though in a chastened and difficult sense. Creative life can endure if bureaucracy becomes material for deep knowledge, avoiding the trap of becoming life's final definition. Administration teaches scale, consequence, institutional shape. It strips away adolescent fantasies of boundless spontaneity. Such work shows how budgets and commands enter the daily texture of a polity. A great writer who has known these things may think more deeply about dependence, action, the tragic density of public existence. Yet bureaucratic life also carries a constant temptation to flatten the spirit. It privileges whatever can be processed efficiently. The system rewards impersonal clarity. Its machine overvalues closure. Art survives within such a regime only by preserving a domain where personal feeling and moral ambiguity remain speakable. Goethe preserved that domain through brilliant transposition. He turned office into sacred exile in Iphigenia in Tauris, while transforming juridical destiny into the courtly anguish of Tasso. The wax disc educated the poet precisely on what must be defended against official speech, failing to silence him. An observer might say the great gain of Weimar was form. The great loss was spontaneity, at least in its earlier volcanic mode. Yet that formulation needs careful adjustment. The spontaneous young artist of the 1770s was hardly more authentic than the chastened figure of the 1780s. Authenticity itself changes once a life has passed through heavy institutions. Later authority comes from tested measure, replacing eruptive confidence. The duchy gave him prolonged intimacy with duty, while teaching the sobering fact that ideals must survive contact with paper and human fatigue. From that physical contact came a new power of synthesis. The creator ceased to be merely herald of raw sensibility. He became a master anatomist of role and law. The cost was great inner strain. The reward was a broader, sterner human truth. The Weimar official remains indispensable to any understanding of the poet. To bypass those years is to flatten his greatness into legend. A man who had evaded service would have remained ignorant of renunciation's heavy dignity and the tension between delegated authority and inner command. The official years operate as the furnace in which the contradiction of modern authorship first became explicit in his life, far more than a regrettable interruption between youthful rebel and later sage. We must ask what it means for a writer to be at once servant of the state and servant of the word. Upon his shoulders, the duchy placed that question long before the modern world had found a steady answer. His dramatic works remain among the most exact responses ever given by a human mind. Return once more to the physical object itself. The ducal seal begins as a practical emblem of administration. It ends as miniature metaphysics. One face belongs to utility and the austere prose of governance. Another face belongs to lyric openness, to speech that refuses to become merely official. His first Weimar decade was lived suspended between those two faces. He carried literary insurgency into a rigid structure, where it surrendered pure innocence. The artist learned severe service. Within the servant, a living remnant endured against total absorption. The stamped crest pressed both truths into his daily life. Warm wax received a complex reality the soul could hardly reconcile. The closing question must therefore return to the beginning. I ask what the object means now. It means a divided contract with power, far beyond ducal sanction. It shows how authority can enlarge a life, while threatening its deep source. Public usefulness may educate genius, while asking that genius to speak in a borrowed bureaucratic tongue. The writer who serves too close to the center of decision must either surrender the deepest ground of speech or find a way to keep that ground alive, within forms the state has failed to colonize. Goethe found that way through conflict, brilliant transposition, severe discipline, then geographical flight. The heavy instrument remained on the desk. The poet went on writing against its terrible finality. By the close of the early Weimar story, the physical object has ceased to be a clerkly tool. It has become the sign of a life in which service and resistance were stamped into the same hot wax. Before history let the firm impression cool,